I have to say, first of all, that I am not personally losing confidence in Canadian democracy or Canadian citizens, but I'm profoundly worried about a number of the same trends that John identified, and we come at it from different perspectives. Obviously, as he's just told you, being in Washington, D.C. as bureau chief for the Globe and Mail, watching the U.S. presidential process. I relate in my book how he came from the States, came back to Canada, and I suppose some of my people, what happened to my country, oh my gosh, things have gotten a bit worse. I don't want to put words in your mouth, John, but certainly the advent of Stephen Harper's style of government has been the most closed, top-down dictatorial regime that we've ever had in Canada. But as John points out in his book, every time a Canadian columnist writes, this government is the most centralized, power is concentrated in the Prime Minister more than at any time in history, it's always true. Because starting with Pierre Trudeau, who I think the measures that Trudeau took to create the Prime Minister's office as an entity, it really wasn't. When Lester Pearson was Prime Minister, in the research I did, you go back and you find Tom Kent recalling that Lester Pearson had in the PMO sort of a handful of stenographers and somebody looking after things, and it was real cabinet government. And Tom Kent would say that the Lester Pearson government was the last true cabinet government Canada had. Wonderful anecdotes of John Turner when he was Minister of Justice under Trudeau, complaining to Tom Axworthy, who was then one of the junior staffers at PMO, running around to make sure, nipping at the heels of ministers to make sure they were doing the right sorts of things. And Turner called them the junior G-men, and he wanted to know what they were doing in his office. Well, that's nothing compared to then Mulroney created a much larger PMO, but that's nothing compared to Carleton's PMO, which is nothing compared to Harper's PMO. So if you look at the trends of what's happening in Canadian democracy, although it's true, as John just said, the most powerful political leader in the world is still arguably the President of the United States, it's also true, as Dean Savoy said as a political scientist in Canada, when you study the relative powers of a British Prime Minister, a Canadian Prime Minister, and a U.S. President, in our system in Canada, the Canadian Prime Minister has unrivaled powers compared to the two others within their own nations. And that's because, of course, in Canada we didn't ever have a revolution. We don't have a division between legislative and executive. And a Prime Minister in this country who chooses to try to control everything, as Mr. Harper now does, it doesn't have any checks and balances to control that, other than an obstreperous caucus, which Mr. Harper does not seem to have, or a really engaged media, which we no longer have. I say that with trepidation, but the concentration of corporate media power in this country, combined with the recession and the financial woes of our news media, mean that it's vanishingly true that we never had a Woodward and Bernstein in Canada, for instance, but if we needed one ever, we need them now, and we simply don't have it. The news media has become much less engaged in in-depth whistleblower going after things. Now, in terms of the open and shut argument that John makes, I couldn't agree more. As an environmental lawyer, we always used to joke that if you wanted to try to get any information on what was going on in Canada, you were far better to look at access to information on the U.S. side of the border. If you wanted to find out about pollution in Canada, you were better off to look to the EPA and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to see what they had listed. And recently as Barack Obama's visit to Canada, and of course everyone in Canada knew you'd have to have very heightened security. The newly elected President of the United States was coming here. Obviously, there'd be real security concerns about the agenda. But if you wanted to find out what Stephen Harper and Barack Obama planned to do in Canada, you would have to ask the U.S. news media, because they had a complete schedule, and the Canadian news media was giving very little detail on anything. Remember, as I said, when I was practicing environmental law, we used to joke that Canadian laws constituted freedom from information. And I detail in my book as well how much less information is now flowing. The Privy Council Office, which I really respect the Canadian Civil Service, at its height, when you had a really professional group of people who gave dispassionate advice, who were respected for knowing their stuff, whether it was foreign affairs, and John and I both agree that the role of Canadian foreign service and diplomacy has really declined. There's not the emphasis on our international agenda that there once was. At a time that we desperately need to focus internationally, we are increasingly controlled by a domestic agenda, which is most clearly epitomized by Stephen Harper choosing to skip the United Nations discussions for leaders of governments about nuclear disarmament and the climate crisis in order to stage a photo op at Tim Hortons in Canada. If that is not the epitome, the moment that states Canada no longer cares about the rest of the world, but that targeted, focused message to a base in domestic political terms will outrank the UN anytime you turn around. But we did have that really professional cadre of civil servants who did a marvelous job regardless of who was the political power, because you knew that politicians and prime ministers would come and go, but if you were in the civil service, for good or for ill, you were there to do the best work you could on behalf of the people of Canada. So not to idealize it too much, but there's no question that that political civil service is now, non-political civil service is either ignored by the current government or so deeply politicized that even the Privy Council office is no longer really separate from the political agenda of the PMO. And that's also dangerous. I've never seen the civil service in this country as demoralized and dispirited as they are today. And you have to know that when a Minister of Natural Resources, and I'm sure it was the Prime Minister's idea, decides on 11 o'clock on a Friday night to fire the President of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission for following the letter of the law and doing her job, that has, as Sheila Fraser said, as Attorney General, as our Auditor General, that has a real chilling effect on everyone involved in regulating for health and safety. If you know you're fired for protecting health and safety and making a government look bad, that has a very profound and negative effect on the job the civil servants are doing. And of course, it would scare off anyone from regulating in a way that you might think would cross the interests of your political bosses. So my thesis in my book, right, that kind of covers the resonance between the two of us, this is not a book about the Green Party, it's about a crisis in democracy. I think that the evidence for a crisis in Canadian democracy is made evident just by the declining levels of voter turnout. Only roughly 58% of Canadians voted in our last federal election. It's not just the young people who are not voting. It's a lot of people my age. I meet on the doorsteps and they say, well, I last voted in 1997 or I last voted in 1993. And I hear far too often people say, I just figured I wanted to stop encouraging them. I think, well, wait a minute. Voting is not a way of, it's not a reality TV show where when you vote, you show you actually like someone on stage. This is, in fact, democracy, and we have the ability and the power to vote for a representative who will represent our views. And voting is the way we control the decision makers in government. It's not a way of sending them a signal that we're happy with the job they're doing. In fact, by not voting, you're giving a pat on the back to whatever politician you find most despicable. Because the trend in reducing voter turnout is also a manipulated trend where at least the current government in power in the last election used a number of things as tactics to expand the number of MPs who were elected as conservatives while deliberately reducing voter turnout. So we can talk about this as well. We need to encourage people to vote. I know Canada was here handing you all material as you came in the door. One of the things that I think would be the single most salutary change to get Canadians voting again, to ensure representative democracy, and to reduce the excessive power of organized political parties whose partisanship and an agenda at all times focused on an election instead of on governing is actually poisoning the functioning of government, because the House of Commons is increasingly a war ground for an election campaign that isn't on right now. And that has to end. To do that, I think we do make the single biggest step in the right direction would be to have proportional representation. There's a lot more I'd like to say.